Welcome to Is It the Podcast? From Rembrandt to Rubens, from Van Dyck to Van Eyck, each episode examines an artwork with an uncertain authorship, in dialogue with a leading guest expert. We'll tell the story of the artist we suspect created the work, of the work in question, and then we reveal the results of a cutting-edge AI authentication analysis performed by the Swiss firm Art Recognition. I'm your host, Professor Noah Charney. So, is it? Welcome to this episode. Today we turn our spotlight on Jan van Eyck and a small, exquisite painting, St. Francis of Assisi Receiving the Stigmata, now in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Along with today's guests, Johanna Induni of Art Recognition and Till-Holger Borchert, Director General of the museums in Aachen, we'll ask whether it is in fact by Van Eyck. Now, it never occurred to me to ask, since I remember it as having been featured in my Northern Renaissance art textbook at university, so I assumed there was no question. Well, now it's time to find out. Jan van Eyck is one of those artists who feels inevitable in the story of art, as though the Northern Renaissance bends around him. Now, he didn't invent oil painting, but he perfected it so thoroughly that everyone else seemed to be working in his shadow for centuries. His surfaces shimmer with light and detail so fine you need a magnifying glass to take it all in. Every stone, hair, reflection, and a glint seems to be rendered with a kind of supernatural clarity. That ability to make the everyday luminous is why many consider him not only a great painter, but one of the great observers of reality in all of Western art. And yet, for all his fame, Van Eyck's surviving oeuvre is small. Fewer than 20 paintings are universally accepted as by his own hand. That means that any work claimed for him carries weight, intrigue, and a certain responsibility, which brings us to the work at the center of today's episode, St. Francis of Assisi Receiving the Stigmata, a tiny panel in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So if you haven't seen it, I want you to imagine something no bigger than the palm of your hand, yet packed with enough detail to fill a mural. St. Francis kneels before a jagged, rocky outcrop as a seraphic Christ appears in the sky, sending down rays that mark him with the wounds of Christ. It's intimate and dramatic all at once. Around Francis stretches a vast, meticulously rendered world, cracks in the stone, delicate grasses, tiny figures crossing a bridge in the middle distance, and a whole cityscape glimmering far beyond. It has that unmistakable Jan van Eyck quality of making you feel as though you could walk straight into the scene and get lost in it. I first encountered the Philadelphia St. Francis in my Northern Renaissance art history textbook at university, and it was presented as a given, a Van Eyck full stop. It never occurred to me that anyone questioned it. The authors didn't hint at a debate, the museum label didn't either. It simply existed as one of those small but radiant works by a master who tends to define his age. While I'm not a Van Eyck specialist per se, I did write a whole book about one of his paintings, the Ghent altarpiece. Yet my research for that project didn't raise suspicions about this painting. But as with so many artworks, the deeper you look, the more complicated things become. Over time, scholars have wondered whether this painting is truly by Jan van Eyck himself, or perhaps by someone in his workshop, or even by another talented follower working closely from his design. There's also a nearly identical panel in Turin, which adds another layer of mystery. Are the two twin works by the same hand? Two versions of a lost original, perhaps? Or is one a copy of the other? So that's the question at the heart of today's episode. Is the Philadelphia St. Francis actually a work by Jan van Eyck, or is its authorship more complicated than the neat certainty of a textbook would lead you to believe? We'll explore what we know, what we think we know, and what might still surprise us. Today we're joined by Till-Holger Borchert, one of the leading curators and scholars of Northern Renaissance art in the world. Formerly the longtime director of the Bruges Museums and an internationally respected Van Eyck specialist, he now serves as Director General of the museums in Aachen, where he continues to shape some of Europe's most innovative exhibitions and research initiatives. Till, thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to begin by asking you to tell us a little bit about your own background and, I can say, illustrious career. From my perspective, it's very illustrious indeed. But how did you get started?
Well, I was growing up in Hamburg, and I had the idea that I should become somebody who, leaves everything behind. So I actually studied with Japanology. My first studies were that. I started with that. I moved from Hamburg to Bonn. In Bonn, I realized that, the Japanology department required what they called also sound methodology. They recommended art history. And then the switch was quickly done. From there, I went on. Bonn is kind of close to the Low Countries. So I visited regularly, and I kind of got interested in that. By chance, I entered a group of people who were interested in what we call technical art history, sort of essentially making examinations on paintings with the then current methodologies like infrared reflectography. And worked with Dolph van Aspen de Boer, who died a few years ago, Molly Ferris, who died a few months ago. So, in a way, the pioneers of this today, I think, very acknowledged technique that focuses on actually making visible below the paint surfaces the underdrawing of the artist. And after working a while as a journalist, I had the opportunity to curate an exhibition for the Cultural Capital of Europe in Bruges in 2002, and stuck around. And whereas my research interest had been primarily Memling, and it shifted to the 16th century in the Bruges school, Ambrosius Spencer, Adrian Isenband, I all of a sudden found myself more and more involved with the paintings of Jan van Eyck, and have been, luckily enough to work on this material for quite some time.
So, do you remember the first work by Van Eyck that you saw that got you interested, where it was and which work it was?
That's a very good question. I think this must have been the museum in Antwerp, I think. See, I don't actually I don't recall that. I do remember the first time I went to a museum and saw real Netherlandish, masterpieces of that period, because in Hamburg you have a small collection.
Okay.
It must have been Berlin. It must have been the Berlin museums, where I was as a kid rather regularly back then in Dahlem. And I'm sure I admired those things. I'm sure I admired Rogier van der Weyden at that point when I was little. But Van Eyck, I don't remember. I remember first time I went to Antwerp, that part of the collection was closed. Brussels has a great collection, but no Van Eyck, so it must have been probably Bruges. Yeah.
You mentioned when you were studying some of the earlier days of using multispectral analysis to look at underdrawings. And I'm curious, what was the vibe at the time among traditional art historians? Was there a nervousness about that being the newest technology?
Yeah, definitely.
Or was it welcomed at the time?
I think it depends where you were. There was a kind of skepticism, especially in Germany, I would say that a professional jealousy between traditional art historians and what they called conservation sciences, when they probably felt that the conservators, the picture conservators, would get back to them. There was an irrational fear that the invisible rays may destroy whatever is below.
Aha, that's interesting.
All kind of thing. It is interesting, yeah. That's the situation that I experienced when Molly Ferris, Julie Chapuis, and I were doing research for Julian's PhD on Stefan Lochner, and the amount of resistance to be allowed to do that in the Cathedral of Cologne, even at night, was remarkable. On the other hand, there were institutions like the National Gallery of Art in London that had early on bought the equipment, did conduct infrared reflectography research on their own. This is, I think, the first time that I saw one of these machines in action, which was, I think, a quick scanning of the man with the red turban. It must have been in 87, 88 or something like that. And a whole department of conservation scientists chemists that were really doing research into pigments, into the binding media, sort of like the hard sciences on the field. And yes, that was, of course, as a young student, you might imagine, it was very fascinating. And then I went to do an internship in Munich at some point, where Hubertus Falkner von Sonnenburg was the general director, who then later on, he was a restorer, a picture conservator, who then later became the chairman of the Scherfield, I think is the name, Conservation Center in New York, sort of like heading the studios of the Metropolitan Museum. And so this was somebody else who was really encouraging this kind of research, and this is very interesting. And, whereas everyone kind of said, "Oh, if you can't look with your eyes, then you need a machine." So this was a little bit the vibe you had in Germany at that point. And in the Netherlands, because of Dolf, who was the inventor of the reflectography, I think it was early adopted. The Rijksmuseum, Jan Piet Kok, especially in his work on Lucas van Leyden, Molly Ferris, and her work of Jan van Scorel. Those were the pioneers who brought that form, and alongside a German art historian restorer whom I never met, Johannes Taubert, who was already dead in the 70s, did the first PhD in 1956 on the use of infrared photography for art historical purposes.
What about recently? You've been the director of museums. Is there a sense among museum professionals that technology is helpful and here to stay, or is there still some resistance that you find?
Well, it's difficult to say. I think most museums which have the means have invested into technical equipment. Some of them even have the means to pay for the maintenance. No, I think every one of the bigger museums either has the equipment and the scientists in-house, or they're hiring external personnel to do it. In Belgium, for example, you have the Institut Royal Patrimoine Artistique, the Royal Institute of Heritage, which provides such services on a larger scale for all the Belgian museums. So if you have specific questions regarding painting, sculptures, but also glass painting, you can go to them. They have the equipment, and I assure you, the maintenance of some of the equipment is impressive. I mean, financially.
I bet it can be hugely expensive. I'm curious if the vibe among people in the museum world today, with regard to the possibility of AI as a tool to assist in research and analysis, is the resistance similar to resistance to multispectral imaging in the past, and therefore, resistance is to be expected and then it becomes every day afterwards? Or is it a different vibe that AI is bringing to the fore?
I think it is different, and it's more complex, because AI is not only facilitating art historical research, it also has probable functions in mediation of artworks, educational purposes, etc., etc. So I think we are looking at a very diverse professional public that looks at AI as a possible solution to things they always wanted to realize, or a potential threat. I think both plays a role. And there is this expectations, and I think this is where we're coming a little bit to the core of our discussion. There is, of course, the expectation that traditional connoisseurship will become oblivious in the amount of time that AI grows and gets more knowledgeable and can perform the classical tasks of connoisseurs automatically.
Okay. So let's turn now to the work in question. The question we're asking, is it a Van Eyck? But before we get to the answer, tell us about the painting you chose for us to analyze and what you like about it, what you find interesting about it.
Well, as I discussed with our colleagues, I was approached to participate in this particular problem. I think I thought I was interested in a experimental setup that would be more problematic and would challenge the artificial intelligence in a different way than you would expect. in that sense that I believe that we have to get to the edge what's possible to train.
Right.
Right. And so initially I had suggested that it would be interesting to examine one of the miniatures of the so-called Turin-Milan hours, a kind of art historical conundrum ever since these miniatures were discovered, believed to be either works by Hubert van Eyck or early works by Jan van Eyck or late works by Jan van Eyck or having nothing to do with Jan van Eyck whatsoever. And that these lines have, you can see them in historical literature, and this is an ongoing problem. It's quite the same as with the Ghent altarpiece, what's Hubert and what is Jan. Whereas, of course, first of all, the question, what is Hubert and is Jan, is kind of an historical question when it comes to medieval painting, and if only because our ideas of a 19th century artist is not necessarily the way that medieval artists saw each other. In many ways, you could argue that workshop processes were eventually more similar to Andy Warhol's factory or Damien Hirst's studio than to Van Gogh or artists of that period. So there's that, and so we are looking for the individual contribution, but in fact we should kind of acknowledge the possibility of collective production. And there's the question of medium. So there's miniatures painted on parchment with gum arabicum versus oil painting on panel or on canvas or whatever, and so it was apparently difficult to compare miniature paintings to panel paintings, at which point I suggested to look at a small painting in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, beautiful painting displaying the stigmatization of Saint Francis, of which there is a bigger version painted on panel in the Galleria Sabauda in Turin. And it has been argued that there were more than two versions and none of the surviving ones are by Van Eyck. It has been argued that the Philadelphia one is the original. It has been argued that the Turin version is the original. So I thought this is an interesting question. Let's see how far we get. And this is what brings us here today.
So if you could just describe what the work looks like, since this is an audio podcast.
Sure.
So people can get a sense of it. I'm sure that we'll be able to put a link to the image itself in the show notes. But it was painted in principle from 1430 to 1432. The Philadelphia Museum of Art website lists it as definitively by Van Eyck. But what are we seeing when we look at the picture?
It's a small painting of Saint Francis kneeling in a landscape with a bad hair day, you would say. His feet naked. He is wearing the Franciscan habit. His arms are raised. A winged crucifix appears in the sky and connects to the armor. Christi connects it with the wounds that Saint Francis is receiving. In front of him, and that's to say on the right side, there is a figure that is almost rolled in itself. It's Brother Leo, who is sleeping while this appears. This whole setting is in a canyon-like, I would say, sort of landscape where you see the rocks, you see the plateau. In the background, you have a little river with people crossing the river and a cityscape in the far background, and on the left again some dry trees to be seen. This is blue skies, etc., etc. Yeah, I think.
So one of the things that's interesting about that stood out to me is the medium is listed as oil on vellum on panel. Is that unusual to have the vellum layer?
Yes or no? Honestly, it has not been observed for a long time. There are a few works that are on vellum. I believe a friend of mine was trying to do a complete catalog, and it's something you find in Netherlandish, German, but also French painting of the period. So it's not entirely unusual. But of course, when it was first discovered, it made the alarm bells ring. And said, "Oh, that's strange. Maybe this is not true."
We also have, very helpfully, the Philadelphia Museum of Art lists its provenance openly on the website. And so This came initially from a private collection in Lisbon, but then it was acquired by William Acour, the first Baron of Heytesbury, and it was in a collection in Wiltshire in 1843. And from that point, we know that it was attributed to Van Eyck. But also in the mid-19th century, Van Eyck was the most expensive artist one could have on the British market. So this is perhaps optimistic, perhaps accurate. That remains to be seen. But if you had a work of art that looked Van Eyck-ish, that's the one that you should associate with it, because it would have gotten you the most money if you were to put it up for sale.
Yeah, I can see that. But on the other hand, I mean, as we do have a second version,
that's true,
which is slightly less controversial, if I would have been the buyer, I would have been happy and said, "Oh, this is great."
Yeah, of course.
And whereas there are very many works in that period that either are given to Albrecht Dürer or Jan van Eyck, or Memling, for that matter. As these were the names that stuck out. This attribution is surprisingly accurate, I think, in retrospect. It is certainly something that seems to be more or less, I say, contemporary. It's not a later copy that we have one by the so-called master of Hoogstraten, Antwerp painter around in the early 16th century, which is preserved in the Prado. I think that one flies pretty well.
It flies very well. I've seen it in person multiple times, and I think it looks fantastic. I would certainly, as the sort of half connoisseur that I am, I would certainly have attributed it to Jan van Eyck. I think we should bring in our expert from art recognition now. So, Johanna, thanks so much for joining us. And can you give us the big reveal? Is it a Van Eyck?
Well, thank you for having me. And so, no, the painting that we analyzed, so the St. Francis from the Philadelphia Museum of Art, came out as not authentic when we analyzed it with the AI.
Okay, that's a bit of a surprise result, although there are scholars who have questioned whether it is by Van Eyck, whether it might be by his studio, since there's a larger version in Turin. Can you tell us first about what informed the AI? How did you put together the data set that fed information to the AI about what to look for and also what not to be fooled by?
So the way in which we train the AI, we start by collecting the images, and we start by looking for the reference catalog raisonné that will be used as a basis. So for this project, we used the catalog that Till kindly shared with us. And once we have the catalog raisonné, we start by creating the authentic data set, which means that we collect the images of the artworks that are considered to be by Van Eyck. And so these paintings, images, artworks are documented and recognized as from Jan van Eyck. And we cross-validate them with the catalog raisonné that we use as a reference. So this is the first part, which is the collection of the authentic data set. And so the positive example, and then there is the negative example, which are also very important. And this is the second step. And so the not authentic data set includes, for example, artworks that are not by Van Eyck. So it will be, for example, paintings or artworks by the related artists, by a follower, some imitations, some known forgeries, and some synthetic images. So meaning they have been AI generated. And so by including these works, it teaches the AI to differentiate between the artist's authentic creations and the other's work. And so also we make sure to use high quality images so that the model is able to extract from very good images and therefore be able to learn more refined details. And yes, so this approach is allowing the AI to learn the patterns and the characteristic features of the artist, and to therefore distinguish what is an authentic to what is not authentic.
Walk me through the heat map that you generate. That's a fun graphic. How do we read that?
Yes, so as you can see, the heat map is kind of colorful. There is a blue, there is some red. So first make sense of this. The red areas are the most influential ones for the algorithm decision making. So the more it decreases towards the yellow, the less important it is. And at the opposite of the spectrum, we have the blue areas, which are the ones that have the least impact for the decision. And so for this painting of St. Francis in question, the most relevant areas were the St. Francis chest, his right arm, and the fabric surrounding also the arm, as well as beneath the right arm and part of the rock that is in the background on the right side of the painting.
And so if this is considered not a Van Eyck, according to the AI's analysis, that doesn't necessarily mean that it didn't come from Van Eyck's studio. It means that Van Eyck's individual artistic hand is not detected. Is that right?
Yes, so exactly like you said, it could be that this is a work by someone from the workshop, someone follower, or so this doesn't exclude this possibility. Yes.
So Till made a good request that would be really interesting. Is it possible maybe for us to also analyze the Turin version of this painting to see if that maybe has Van Eyck's hand in it. And then all of a sudden it allows us to paint a more thorough picture of what this result might mean. Whereas the one version is the original, and this was a second one assigned to someone in his workshop. Maybe that's something that we can do to do a follow-up episode.
Yes, exactly. I mean, as they are so similar in a way, it would be indeed interesting to run an analysis with the AI through the Turin version and see what comes out. Yes.
Here's a technical question. Would you have to update the data set for the AI now with these results in mind to have this Philadelphia version as something that is listed as not by Van Eyck and to remove the Turin version from the list of works that are attributed to Van Eyck? Because otherwise, if it already has the Turin version in it because it's in the Catalogue Raisonné, it's going to, of course, say, "Oh, this is accurate." So you have to basically update the data set.
Yes, so I think how the tech guy do it is obviously the image on which we train is not fed within the images that we are using. So, like you say, the trained image would be removed from the authentic images. And then the question will be whether the Philadelphia version goes in the imitations or whether it is also removed. But the way in which it works is that there is always 10% of the whole data set that is separated and used for training so that it actually randomly checks. But yes, to answer to your question, the Turin version will have to be removed from the authentic data set.
Yeah, I'm going to put in a request for us to do this if we can, and we can
Yes.
either add a coda to this episode or have a special mini bonus episode. But thank you so much, Joanna, for taking time to explain this technology to us and
Thank you.
answering the mystery, at least in part, which is part of the fun of this, is the answer to one question opens up how we interpret the work of art and where we can place it in the story of Van Eyck's oeuvre. So it's a very exciting multi-level mystery. And thank you so much for helping us to move closer toward a solution.
Well, thank you for having me. I mean, indeed, the Van Eyck is quite a complex artist. So yes, this is indeed an exciting project.
Johanna, thank you for that. So Till, the software believes that this is not by Van Eyck's hand. So that is a bit of a surprise to me because it looks so good. But on the other hand, what can we do with this information if we are to believe it in its accuracy? And from my experience with this sort of analysis with art recognition, it's remarkably accurate. So with this in mind, what does it tell us about the work in question?
Well, I think it tells us there are differences, but these differences can be related to the difference in material. So we are again looking at a painting which is actually not on wood, but on parchment, has a different surface. And when I was confronted with the initial results, my question is, what are the parameters that the artificial intelligence looks at, given with the idea that there might be flexible, and in the classical set Morellian way of connoisseurships, you compare different, preferably less significant parts, because that's sort of the theory, 19th century, because in those parts, the artist manifests itself. So if you have a copyist who's trying to copy something, he will try to copy the faces as exactly as possible, and probably when he is painting the fingernails, he will slip, and then you see, oh, this is a typical fingernail bite. Just to get the or the ears or whatever. Now, from what I understand, and Johanna was so kind as to share what she called a heat map, is that there are specific areas of the painting that the artificial intelligence looks closer at than others. These are the faces, these are part of the landscapes or whatever. So it's not that the painting is analyzed 100% in every pixel that you look at. It's sort of like it has clusters. And of course, now it would be interesting to see what it says about the terrain version. If that's 100% Van Eyck, or also there are doubts, which of course would, in a way, make this recognition more relative and would support those who have in the past said both versions are not original by Van Eyck, but copies, or printed by the workshop, or. Huh? So it's, as I said, it's an ongoing process. And for me, this is why I was kind of exciting to join you in this, is really to make an arrangement, to make a kind of a laboratory setup, which poses particular questions to the artificial intelligence in order to make it, I wouldn't say fail, but to deliver results that are at least questionable, so that you can actually sharpen the methodology. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
So the next question is sort of, okay, which parts of the paintings look like Van Eyck? That would be one of the questions. And then you would eventually sort of deal with the idea, okay, there are different hands involved, even in such a small painting, which would cater to my notion of collective, production and late medieval workshops and all that. So for me, this is not necessarily a definitive answer. And if only because it sort of like poses additional questions that now needs to be looked at.
I would agree with that. Especially of interest is the idea that because of the function of the studio system, the aspects like faces and hands that would be focal points for the master, if a work comes out of Jan van Eyck's studio, it doesn't necessarily mean that he actually physically painted the surface level of all aspects of it. That's a misconception that people get from this 19th century idea of the lone artist in a garret in Paris, drinking absinthe and smoking cigarettes and wearing a beret and doing every aspect of the work themselves.
And having lap dances.
But it's that would be interesting, because our concept of sole authorship as the sign of authenticity works much better with, like, let's say 19th century paintings than it does 15th.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But additionally, if I may say that, I mean, you also have the notion that it would be the hands and the feet and the faces which were the task of the artist. And I think, generally saying, in the case of Van Eyck, I would agree, but I could also imagine, and I think especially a painter like Jacques Terré is a little bit of an example, who is an absolute stunning painter of all. I mean, when you look at the 4 panels by Jacques Terré, for the made originally for an altarpiece in the Abbey of Saint Vaast in Arras in 1435, then you see it's an amazing piece when it comes to painting the flowers, the grass, jewels, and all what we consider to be secondary is done with an incredible precision, and a precision that you find in some of the works by the master of Lemal and even Rogier in a similar level, but not quite on all of them. So As a model, you could imagine that actually this Jacques Daré was a specialist in that kind of painting, and a little bit like Patinier when he hired Dürer to make sketches for Saint Christopher, because he couldn't, or he was not skilled enough to do figures and was specialized in landscape. It can take all forms, and we assume things that are not necessarily sort of like set in stone, and we need to be open to question those over and over and over again, up to a certain degree. Yeah? So I don't say that you have to go all the way, because then you open the floodgates of everyone who sings because he has a sunflower. It must be Van Gogh.
But it's legitimate to consider that, especially this work. So first of all, I would love to test the Turin one, and we can maybe have a second follow-up mini episode about that. But the fact that this is so much smaller, 5 by 5 3/4 inches, the fact that it's oil on vellum on panel, it's entirely possible that we could imagine someone saw the Turin one, which is the original, commissioned this smaller version of Van Eyck's studio, and Van Eyck may have supervised but not actually painted it and assigned the painting process to someone in his studio.
Or the studio worked on his own, I mean, I've been an advocate for that also for a time. We know that Van Eyck dies. We know the studio must have continued, because there are a few works that I lovingly refer to, Eyckian apocryphs. And it seems that, at least until the mid 1440s, if not later, there were people in Bruges executing, unfinished paintings by Van Eyck and putting them on the market, and I don't know what. In this particular case, we know there is the testament of Anselm Adonis, if I'm not mistaken, who gives 2 of those paintings of St. Francis to his daughter. So there is no need for him to have 2 originals by Van Eyck, right? So he must have ordered a copy. Why the copy is smaller, or if there were both copies, they were both smaller, but only one survives. We don't know. There is also a testament by a Spanish painter called Juan Rexach, who owned a painting made in oil of St. Francis by a master Jan, which is very likely Jan van Eyck, also because we have another Spanish painter, the master of Porciuncula, who obviously knew the painting and tried to emulate with his limited means. So there were more than one version around. Which one is the original? If there was something like an original, if the workshop produced several ones, this is all open to questions, especially if you think that the main figure, that is St. Francis itself, who is kneeling on the ground with his naked feet showing under his Franciscan habit, with both hands raised, and you see that the feet are actually motifs that reappear in the group of the apostles in the Ghent altarpiece. So it's not something that he invents here. And the figure itself is very similar to kneeling donor figures like Nicolas Rollin in the Rollin Madonna in Paris, or Jan Voss in the Frick Madonna in New York. So you see, this is where it becomes complex. On one hand side, exciting, on the other hand side, and this is why I personally think the challenges that the oeuvre of Van Eyck, probably also Rogia, poses to artificial intelligence are nice. They're interesting challenges that, if approached and if taken serious, may actually lead to a more precise ability and sort of like increases the learning curve, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely. It's also important to keep in mind that if you were to ask the owner from 1834, Baron Heytesbury, he would say that this is a Van Eyck, even if it emerged from the studio of Van Eyck. And our focus on the artist's direct hand is sometimes we're so focused on who made this and the authorship story. And you see this with celebrity paintings where people wanting to take a selfie in front of it because they've heard of the artist in question and they're not really bothering looking at the work, that it's anachronistic to the way people would have thought of it back then. If it's something that emerges from Van Eyck's studio, it's considered a Van Eyck. And it would be great in principle to have AI trained on all of the members of an artist's studio, and then you could see which of the members did which parts. That's a level up that would be a lot of work, but very interesting to do, I think.
Well, I mean, you asked me at the beginning of this podcast about my training in a way, and I talked about infrared reflectography. In the course of this 30 plus years that I've been in the field, we saw also an increased use of or understanding that it might be useful to use the same camera setup, the same type of camera, the same camera with the same resolution to document the painting, the same distance with the same type of light, to avoid that accidental factors sort of influence the results. And when we look at artificial intelligence, there is nothing wrong with that. But the ideal situation is, of course, that we don't look randomly at images that are on the web or provided or you can download or whatever, but you would have them photographed in high resolution and, at the same conditions, a little bit what in the case of Van Eyck, the Royal Institute of Heritage has done with the website Closer to Van Eyck, that offers, really comparable images and work from there, which of course becomes then an extremely expensive endeavor, time-consuming and expensive endeavor. And I think you needed to have funding to pursue that, but why not?
This has been fascinating, Till. Thank you so much. I'm going to see if we can also test the Turin version, in which case we might have a short follow-up episode. But thank you so much for your time. And
I would, in any way, be very interesting to see results. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much again. And I hope to see you, maybe Aachen. You never know, but it's always a treat when our paths cross. So thank you again.
Okay. No, take care, Johanna. Thank you very much. Take care.
Attributions are flexible creatures, shifting over time as new evidence comes to the fore. This is just one of the many surprises we've already revealed in just the first half of Season 1 of this podcast series. We'll be checking the Turin version later on, so we may revisit this theme in a future episode. Thanks for listening to Is It? The Podcast. This series is produced by Urshka Charney, presented by Noah Charney, and is brought to you by Art Recognition. Based in Zurich, Art Recognition is the leading firm for AI-driven authentication of artworks. Featured everywhere from the art newspaper to Wired to The Guardian and beyond, Art Recognition uses the most definitive, sophisticated datasets and advanced processes to estimate the likelihood that a specific artist created an artwork. Backed by a multidisciplinary team that takes many dimensions of research into consideration, Art Recognition has a long track record of success at the highest level. Learn more at art-recognition.com. That's art-recognition.com. We'll be back next time with a new art historical mystery, a new possible artist behind the masterpiece, and a new guest expert. See you next time.